everybody. I hope you're all well and looking forward to a lovely Easter. This is the Introverted Astrologer, and this week I'm bringing you a series of videos on our main UK political leaders. Now, we're certainly going to see a lot of surprises in the next couple of years, and it's quite startling just how many of our leaders are going to be affected. So if you thought this current political landscape is going to stay roughly same old, that's not the case. This isn't random, it's because there's a common pattern linking most of these leaders together. And at the 11th hour, this pattern is going to be broken open with tremendous disruption, shocks, shifts. And this pattern is the hallmark of Uranus. So before we begin with Keir Starmer, let's briefly step back and look at what Uranus actually represents, because its meaning goes far beyond simple change. In Greek mythology, Uranus, known as Uranus, was the original sky god, and he ruled over the world. He had many children with Gaia, including the Titans and the Cyclops, but he treated his children terribly. He feared the power of what he had created in his children, and so he forced them to remain hidden, suppressed, unable to emerge. Myth varies on how he achieved this, but ultimately he suppressed them, and the tension of that became too great. His son Kronos rose up against him and overthrew him in a violent act of castration that split the heavens from the earth. And so here we have the first face of Uranus, that moment when something rigid that has been held in place for too long is suddenly broken apart. Those themes of rebellion, of instability and disruption, of rejection and breakthrough are all some of the hallmarks of Uranus. But there's another myth that astrologers often associate with this planet, and this one speaks less of overthrow and more of awakenings. The Titan Prometheus defied the gods by stealing fire to give it to humanity. Up until then, humans had been living in darkness and they were weak and vulnerable. By sharing the wonder of fire with them, Prometheus was able to pass on awareness, knowledge, the spark of consciousness itself, all of which are symbolized by fire. And so essentially, Prometheus gave humans independence and power. This angered the gods greatly, and his punishment for doing this was most severe and brutal. He was chained to a rock and forced to endure an ongoing cycle of suffering. Every day, an eagle would come to eat at his liver. Overnight, his liver regenerated, only to be eaten again the next day. So essentially, the punishment was eternal suffering. And this myth symbolises the second face of Uranus, that spark of fire which brings awakening and enlightenment. We can see new possibilities, sometimes with tremendous speed, but it isn't without consequence. So with that in mind, let's turn now to Keir Starmer to see how Uranus is going to shape the next phase of his public role. Keir Starmer's chart has quite a few striking things about it. We have this very tight formation here in the mutable signs, and it includes his sun, so very closely conjunct with Pluto. This is telling us something about drive, determination, potentially even ruthlessness. But there's also an immense self-control. And because it's taking place against the backdrop of Virgo, this could almost be to the point of being robotic. There is such a deep need to tie in the finer details, to think strategically and clearly with great precision. And I think in Keir's case, we'd probably all agree that his need for mastery and precision is shown in how carefully he operates through being very restrained. Now, this conjunction is opposed by a Jupiter-Chiron conjunction in Pisces. Pisces is certainly not the first sign that we would think of if we were looking for rationality and precision. But I think this placement is telling us a lot about Keir Starmer's ideology, his deeply held beliefs, and to a certain extent also the desire to overstretch somewhat and impose them on others, because Chiron is caught up in this. I think it may also be suggestive of wounded authority or of needing to heal old wounds through being in positions of responsibility. There is also absolutely no fire in this chart, and that's interested me because there's something I can see in his numerology too, which I'll get to soon. But without fire, we lose a bit of the spontaneous, creative spark, that impulsive energy that says, look at me, I'm here, I'm alive, let's take risks, let's create. This lack of fire is signifying somebody less dramatic, more restrained, somebody more self-contained. So what common pattern is it that I've seen which is implying huge changes ahead? Well, it is precisely this big dollop in mutable signs. There are 5 bodies that I'm focusing in on. They fall across Virgo and Pisces. Now, Uranus moves back into Gemini towards the end of this month, and it will make a final square with Keir's natal Uranus. And one of the things that makes Uranus particularly difficult for somebody like Keir Starmer is that the chart is set up for somebody who would rather depend on a very rational strategy where everybody stays in their place and does the things that they're supposed to do. And Uranus is an outer planet energy that has no interest in stability or particularly rigidity. Now, Uranus did start to square his own natal Uranus last year, and this is not a kind of transit where we would assume a rapid fall from position, but it is nonetheless uncomfortable. And in that space of just a couple of weeks, we had the furore over Angela Rayner, who subsequently had to resign as Deputy Prime Minister, followed by the emergence of the whole Peter Mandelson scandal, and finally Keir Starmer's Director of Political Strategy, somebody by the name of Paul Ovenden, had to resign after some rather embarrassing and inappropriate emails came to light. And these events all took place very rapidly, one after the other. And Uranus requests that we are true to ourselves. And indeed, Keir Starmer found himself in the middle of some rapidly unfolding, unpredictable events which required him to stand by his pledge of a Labour Party which wouldn't put up with shady shenanigans amongst its members. Will Uranus do any further damage as it makes a parting shot to its natal position? This will be exact in May. Will there be any further reputational damage? This is also the time of the local elections amongst some of our councils, and we'll have to wait and see. Now, Uranus will continue moving direct until it reaches approximately 6 odd degrees of Gemini by this September. It will then turn retrograde. However, by June of 2027, we are going to see multiple transits from Uranus coming one after the other as it simultaneously forms squares with his Sun, his Pluto, his Jupiter, his Chiron. These squares will happen in quick succession through the months of June, July and August. And so if Keir Starmer was hoping for a peaceful summer holiday, it won't be happening this year. In itself, this is of the magnitude where one would wonder if he would survive intact. And it is the part of his chart which is so strong on mastery, control, ideology, which is going to be cracked open by Uranus. I think people have been predicting Starmer's departure since 2025, and I couldn't see it being likely then. And I do think his strongest tests are coming in 2027. I have a suspicion that he'll be limping by the time we move into 2027, and I'll explain why shortly. However, in my opinion, next year is the year of real reckoning, and we'll also look at his numerology to see if his numbers add a bit of illumination. Now, astrology can predict periods of trouble, of strain, of truly difficult years in our lives, but it can only forecast a spectrum of possibilities as opposed to concrete events. And what I can see laying ahead is such widespread stress coming from multiple different angles in his chart that this seems a more likely year for a great reckoning. Let's have a quick look at some of the main themes that I can see for this year, bearing in mind that we have local elections coming in a few weeks' time and he is already out on the campaign trail. Let's have a look at Saturn and see what kind of structure and firming up is unfolding. Saturn is moving through early Aries, and within the last couple of weeks it opposed Starmer's natal Mercury. Bear in mind that during the stretch of this particular transit, Keir Starmer lost his cabinet secretary, his chief of staff and his communications director, all in one fell swoop. That is pretty textbook Saturn Mercury, because we have his senior figures across strategy, communication and administration all going within a fortnight of each other, and that includes Morgan McSweeney, who has come under a lot of criticism and media coverage since Keir assumed power. Starmer will be having another interesting Saturn transit because Saturn will square his Mars, and this is already moving closer, and it will cover this April when Starmer is out on the campaign trail. This contact can bring some physical tiredness. It can bring some repressed anger and criticism too. It isn't an easy transit, and we could feel forced to do something that we hate doing. So it's not ideal for the month pre-local elections. And there are a couple of other transits that I'll just remind you of. And so if I draw you down to Starmer's natal Saturn, we can see that transiting Pluto is going to start conjuncting it this year within about 20 minutes of arc. So I think the slow, deep psychological work of Pluto will begin. And Saturn in our charts tells us a lot about how we manage to structure lives. And when Pluto forms a conjunction with Saturn, Pluto operates at a deeply psychological level and begins to tear down those boundaries that we keep around ourselves. It exposes areas where we feel more vulnerable or fearful. And so although this is not a transit that would remove somebody from power immediately, it is a transit that adds to this ongoing building pressure. And although we don't have an exact birth time, we can see that his solar arc, Mars, is around 9.5 degrees of Virgo. So it's currently on the area of his Sun and Pluto. But this looks very much like the early signalling of some very decisive actions where the stakes are extremely high because Pluto is here too, and where every move carries great weight, huge consequence. And this year Neptune begins to make its first contact with his natal Mercury by opposition. And so the risk of misunderstandings growing this year is strong. There could be unclear communications, confusion and distortion around facts, agreements, contracts, possibly those involving formal alliances too. I think international diplomacy is an area where Keir will have to tread very carefully and keep an eye on the detail. At some point too, Saturn will oppose his natal moon, but without a precise birth time, I wouldn't be able to tell you when. But it is another sign of emotional pressure and perhaps feeling rather isolated. In political charts, the moon can also be representative of the people, in which case a moon-Saturn opposition would be describing a public mood that could be increasingly cool and critical. Now, his progressed moon is certainly in the sign of Aquarius, but exactly where we can't be sure. We can be sure, however, that he is in the part of the progressed lunation cycle where the moon is square with the sun. This is the first quarter phase, a time when we start hitting the first major test in our new lunation cycle, and this particular testing point can introduce a crisis of some kind, a point where we have to reassess our direction and perhaps make major decisions or tweaks in our life journey. With these things combined, I think 2026 brings in challenge and undermining. At present, the unfolding war with Iran, the major impact on safe passage for oil in the world, makes this a very tricky time for a change of leadership. It's far more likely that MPs will try to keep everything as stable as possible in order that we just move through this the best we can. Now, what is Keir Starmer's numerology showing us? Can we fill in a few more gaps with that? Now, Keir Starmer's numerology is interesting because it does confirm some of the things that we already know from his chart. Keir Starmer's life path is a 2. His destiny is also a 2. It's a master number though. But if we focus on the 2 for the moment, 2 is our diplomats. It's people who can collaborate, they can mediate and build consensus. 2s work best by forming alliances and balances with the people around them. Relationships are extremely important. 2 is not particularly assertive or challenging. The drive is rather for consensus and agreement. And I was interested when I placed his birth date in the grid you can see here, and also transposed his full birth name onto this grid here, because what we can see is this distinct lack of 3s. In numerology, 3 is very versatile, creative, chatty, articulate, thrives on being a communicative, expressive, bubbly kind of energy. And there is simply none here for Keir. And this absence of 3s is confirming a trait which we picked up in his astrology, which was the total lack of fire. So that spontaneity, the easy humour, the very warm, expressive energy is lacking. We have many strengths. We have great practicality, which reinforces all the Virgo we've seen, and somebody who has become very determined and strong-willed as he's progressed through life. We can also pick up that although he isn't an intensely spiritual person, and bear in mind that to be spiritual you do not necessarily have to believe in a god. I'm talking spirituality in its wider sense, and although he isn't essentially that, I think he would keep an open mind. Now, if we move down to the bottom of the screen, this is where I've set up some of his important life cycles, and these really did impress me while I was studying, because numerology and the calculation of our life cycles and our personal years is fascinating, and it filled in some gaps in my life which I could sort of see through transits, but I knew that they were very deeply important turning points, and I couldn't find them using the method of traditional astrology that we call zodiacal releasing. And yet numerology, I could grasp it straight away. Those key turning points in my life were there. Now, Keir Starmer is in his final major life path period and also his final pinnacle. These periods will now stretch for the rest of his life, and they are both 9. In numerology, 9 is a number which represents culminations, legacies, harvests, endings, and the fact that it's being emphasised by appearing twice is important. This is about winding things down. Over an extended period, we can keep coming up against repeated endings in a way that can get quite emotionally draining. 9 also can bring in perspective, wisdom. We can see the bigger picture, but nonetheless, life is asking for culmination, not continuation. And so the other numbers for his next couple of years will be important if they don't align well with his major life cycles. Now, the current year is a little tricky because he is in a personal year 3, and 3 is that numerological energy which we discussed, which he doesn't have. And so this is drawing on something which is lacking, the ability for easy and warm self-expression, for strong communication and visibility with a creative and adaptive approach. And yet his essence is 7, which is far more introspective. And so we have this person who places great emphasis on maintaining cooperative and helpful relationships out there with other major political figures, yet could have difficulty with forming a strong narrative and maintaining a very self-confident and warm outward projection of himself. Moreover, the essence of 7 is suggesting that Keir is actually very much focused inwards, because this is a very introspective number. It's very analytical and deep diving, but the year is actually asking for him to be projected outwardly, and this could lead to some tension as we move into 2027. His personal year 4 is suggesting a time of work and structure which could be difficult. It isn't necessarily a time of great authority, and the transition from essence 7 to essence 8 isn't a fluid or easy progression. 8 is about authority, power, the ability to take charge and transform. And yet Keir Starmer has no 8s in that natal potential. We can see the amplification of 2 energy everywhere, and yet 8 is not interested in seeking balance and cooperating. 8 is about taking charge and power, and I think in light of all the Uranus transits he'll be having too, this essence is suggesting a difficult progression, one where he is under pressure to act very quickly in a system that is already unstable. Moreover, he would need personal traits which were underdeveloped or absent in order to navigate some very intense terrain. Thank you for watching. Perhaps one of the people that will be the most impacted by Uranus will be Nigel Farage, and his chart is actually already being triggered. I think this is causing a great deal of personal unsettlement, and this too is thanks to Uranus. So keep your eyes open, because I'll be bringing you Farage's astrology and his numerology too in the next couple of days. Until then, take very good care of yourselves, and God bless you all.